Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out on this rainy day. I'm Andrea Sato with the Wilton Library, and we're pleased to partner once again with SPED NET and the Wilton Public Schools and Newtown SPED PTA. So, anyway, the ladies' rooms across the hall, thank you for finding a place to park. I know it's difficult. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robin with SpedNet to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for coming out on a cold, rainy, it feels like fall, right? We're finally officially into fall. My name's Robin Spath. On behalf of SpedNet, I'd like to welcome you to this is our second educational program of the year. SpedNet is a very special organization. It was started over 25 years ago as a nonprofit by a group of parents to educate and empower parents of students with special needs to help them become their children's best advocates. I think we all want to be that, right? In addition to our webinars and presentations, we have support groups, and we also have an amazing website. How many people have been on our website? Yeah, it's a huge resource. If you ever have any other issues that you would like more information, there's a great search function, and I bet we have something on it. It's years and years and years of our presentations and webinars, and they're sorted by topic and speaker. And there's also related articles and other materials. I was formerly on the faculty at the School of Social Work at UConn and have had the opportunity to interface with many different types of nonprofit organizations. And SpedNet is truly, truly a special nonprofit. It is completely run by volunteers like me. And so if you find what we do helpful, I would encourage you to donate, because everything we do is free and open to the public, and not any of us take any money for this work. We do it because we're passionate about it. So it truly is a unique organization, and any money you donate goes directly into programming. Couple of things to keep in mind. This is an open forum, and this is being recorded. Wilton Library has an amazing recording system. So we cannot guarantee confidentiality. You may not want to reveal any private information in your questions. The video will be sent out to all of you after today's event, and will be posted on our website and our YouTube channel. Any information we present is for general informational purposes only and is not intended to be legal or therapeutic advice. And lastly, today's session is presented in partnership with Wilton Public Library, Wilton Public Schools, and Newtown SPED PTA. So now, the exciting stuff. I get to talk about our speaker. Yael Rothman is a pediatric neuropsychologist specializing in comprehensive evaluations for children, adolescents, and young adults with a wide range of conditions that impact learning, behavior, social skills, and/or emotional functioning. Our kids. In addition to her clinical work, Dr. Rothman has presented at national and international conferences, published articles in peer-reviewed journals, been a guest on numerous podcasts, and given many lectures to parents in schools. So we're very lucky to have her. She's the co-author with Dr. Katita Fredrickson of the Different Thinkers series, which is designed to teach elementary-age children about their diagnoses. Different Thinkers ADHD was published in January 2024, and Different Thinkers Autism was published just this year in March. She is the owner of Rothman Pediatric Neuropsychology and shares an Instagram account with her co-author to provide evidence-based information to parents and caregivers. So can you please join me in welcoming Dr. Rothman?
Oh, thank you. Yes, yeah. Hi, thank you all for coming out today. So nice to meet you. And I look forward to talking today about one of my favorite topics, what I do. So, this is a parent's guide to psychoeducational and neuropsychological evaluation. We're going to go through a lot today. We're going to talk about what is neuropsychology, what happens in a neuropsychological evaluation, who may benefit, and then a little bit about the school based assessment, which is usually called a psychoeducational evaluation versus a neuropsychological evaluation. How would you talk to your child about an assessment? What happens when you get feedback after an assessment is completed? How do you interpret these results? And then just a few concluding remarks and some question and answer time. If you feel like your question is quite relevant to what I'm saying, please, you can try interrupt me while I'm talking, or you can wait till the end. So, what is neuropsychology? This is a specialized field of psychology that really focuses on brain behavior relationships. It draws from many different areas: the cognitive sciences, neurology, neuroanatomy, all areas of psychology. And we use tests as tools for structured observations. Neuropsychologists can do a lot of different things with our degrees. We can assist with diagnostic clarification, for example, in neurodevelopmental conditions, which is one of my specialties, like diagnoses of ADHD, learning disorders, etc. Memory disorders, for example, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, as well as localization of injury and stroke and epilepsy. It also is an important piece where we help with treatment planning at school, therapy, or home. Some providers complete forensic work and work with the court systems, and some solely will do research. Neuropsychologists are trained in clinical psychology programs, so we are actually all clinical psychologists first. They either have a doctorate of philosophy or a doctorate of psychology. And then we go on to complete a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in neuropsychology following our graduate program. Our license and certification is of a clinical psychologist. And then some individuals will go on to complete board certification. But unlike the medical profession, I'm not sure if people are familiar, not as many psychologists will receive board certification. I think a number I got was like 4% of psychologists go on to receive board certification. So I'm going to talk about school-based evaluations a little later in this presentation, but I just wanted to bring it to our attention as well now that I'm talking about what a neuropsychological evaluation is. Um, these are not neuropsychological evaluations, so therefore they're not as comprehensive. So they're limited in scope, and I will talk about this in a little bit. Often a psychoeducational assessment is completed as part of a school evaluation, which includes cognitive testing like an IQ, and academic achievement testing, looking at measures for reading and writing and math. Private practitioners could also conduct a psychoeducational assessment. I would say in most cases, if that's what you're receiving in a private evaluation, you might not be going to a neuropsychologist. But I will talk about that more. So let's talk about a neuropsychological evaluation and what would happen here. So, a neuropsychological evaluation assesses a patient's profile of strengths and of challenges. This is an important assessment to create a plan for treatment for the school, for therapy, for home, like parenting strategies or organizational supports. And one of the things that I often talk to families about is the point is to figure out the can'ts versus the won'ts. I'm not sure if people hear that phrase often, but I'm thinking of, is this something that a child is unable to do because they have not acquired the skill yet? So that's a can't, versus something they're not so interested in doing, a won't. And guess what? There's going to be a little bit of both. We all don't want to do something sometimes, so that's okay. And you should not have to figure this out. You shouldn't have to be like, what is developmentally appropriate or not if you really have all these questions. A specialist can help you with that as well. I think about this as reframing the narrative a lot of the time. So if a child comes to me and everyone is saying this is a stubborn child, oh, actually, what we found out is that they really struggle with cognitive flexibility. And then we put in place interventions to support that. Or, oh, this child can't put good ideas on paper with writing. Oh, we found out that they have graphomotor issues or organizational challenges. So we're changing the narrative with understanding the can'ts and the won'ts, and then reframing expectations. Usually, the testing in a neuropsychological evaluation can be anywhere from maybe 6 to 7 hours, and it's completing a combination of interview questions, paper and pencil tasks, computer activities, puzzles, other hands on things. Its assessment procedures include the following. So we do a good history. So this is interview with parents and caregivers, but also interviews with many other providers. Collateral interviews are so important because I'm only seeing, although I get to see your child for 6 to 7 hours, which is amazing. Not many providers get that. It's a moment in time in a clinical situation. So I want to hear how they are in many different situations. I've talked to karate coaches. I've talked to the parents of a best friend. I've talked to obviously teachers and psychologists and other tutors. But it all helps me understand a child in many different settings. You can also do, some providers might do a classroom observation so they can see the child before they come into the office. It really depends on the feasibility. Is your school 3 hours away or what? I don't know, whatever it is along those lines. Then there's also a record review interview with the client and questionnaires. We have qualitative and quantitative information that we're receiving. So the qualitative observations, behavioral observations are so important, and they start from the second I meet the child in the waiting room, right? How do they greet me? How do they respond to my greeting? Do they run ahead of me to the room even though they don't know where it is? Or do I show them and then they separate well from their caregiver? Are they able to remain seated? Do they need constant movement and breaks, a reinforcement schedule? All these really important things that help me understand the child from a qualitative perspective. Even things I'm doing right now, you see me gesturing. Is that what the child does when they talk? How are their body language towards me? Also, how do they approach the tasks and the problems? Are they efficient or are they disorganized? And all of this is really important, good information. The quantitative assessment is obviously also very important. It's the structured observations comparing a child to the peers. So that's the testing itself. But as I'm going to talk about, if there's a behavioral observation that happened during that test, it might make that test not as relevant or valid. So we do need both of these pieces to understand the child. This is my procedure when I'm thinking about an evaluation, but it might be a little bit different from one provider to a next. So someone will call for a free intake, and I see if this assessment is appropriate. I do not see everybody who calls me. I turn a lot of people away to get them on the right path because a neuropsychological evaluation is wonderful and amazing and beneficial, but it's not for everyone. It's not something that every single child needs. So that's an important part of this process. Is this appropriate for you? Then it's about completing consent forms and questionnaires, the interview piece and the collateral interviews, and then the in person testing, feedback sessions with the parents, and then I do a separate one with the child, and then you get a written report. So, what are we looking at in a neuropsychological evaluation? You see, it's a lot of different areas of functioning because this is a very comprehensive assessment. So we look at overall intellectual functioning, IQ, attention and executive functioning, speech and language skills, visual thinking, nonverbal reasoning skills, motor, fine motor skills, and how you integrate visual motor integration, learning and memory, social abilities, emotional and academic. I'm going to go through all of these in more detail, but just when you see all of this, you realize why do you, or maybe you ask, like, why do you need to look at all of this? But it is important when you have multiple questions that you're coming in with what's going on with my child. Because let's say you're concerned about an attention problem. You've heard your child is not able to focus in class. And then we realize it's actually a language comprehension weakness. Because if you're sitting in a classroom and don't understand what's being said, wouldn't that be really hard to pay attention? If I was talking in another language you did not know right now, would you pay attention to me? Probably not. You'd probably be focusing on something else and fidgeting. So it is really helpful when we have those multiple questions that we look at the multiple domains to understand. So let's start with IQ. People are familiar with the topic of IQ, yes? So there's a number of components that we look at for overall intellectual functioning, such as reasoning with both verbal and visual domains, the ability to apply knowledge in new situations, processing speed, and working memory, which is an executive skill that I'll talk about in the next slide. One of the things that I will bring up in a little bit is talking about the discrepancies across indices. So sometimes when you get an IQ score, what you're going to see is that the components making it up might be variable. You might have different scores within the subscales that make up an IQ. It, this is important for us to understand a child's strengths and challenges, but the full scale IQ is actually still valid and interpretable even with scatter. There's this phrase in the research world, scatter doesn't matter because the full scale IQ is stable when you think about the predictability for uh, vocational independence and different pieces there. IQ stabilizes around age 9 or 10. So if you get an IQ test done in early childhood, like 6 and under, it wouldn't be surprising to see that change a little bit over time. The future predictability of those scores is limited with a young kid for many reasons. One, 4 and 5 year olds don't know how to take a test, right? So it's going to be hard to assess them completely uh, appropriately because they might be struggling to sit at a table with another professional and get it done. You can, and it still can be very helpful information, but it might change a little bit over time. I've had some families who had a child who was assessed very early in life and maybe had scores that were well above average. And then over time, they get a little bit closer to the average range. That is not that there was a regression of skills or anything went wrong. It actually is what we see. It's a pattern that can happen. There is an index called the Generalized Ability Index, the GAI, that's on some IQ measures, which does not include processing speed and working memory. These measures are often weaker in some diagnoses. So when you see an IQ score, sometimes you see a weakness in these two tasks. You can look at that number, but again, the full scale IQ is an important one for us to see. We obviously want to make sure everything we're talking about for testing can be impacted by the child's availability for the testing experience. So another piece is how valid is the information? Was the child present? Did something else happen? Were they on a different medication than usual? There's an anti-epileptic called Topamax that can make you much slower in your processing. So it really is so many different components that we need to think about when we're considering all this data. Attention and executive functioning. Everyone familiar with executive functioning here? Yeah, maybe not so much. I'm going to do a little spiel and I'll go through it quickly. I bet this is a topic you've heard before. But I like to think about that we stole this word from the business world where executives sit at the top and tell everyone what to do. And that's what we're thinking about this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. And you can see the blue piece there. So this is the higher order processes that direct, control, and organize behavior. This is one of the last part of our brains to develop and form connections, which makes it the most vulnerable and often why it's hit in so many different diagnoses and conditions. While I said the prefrontal cortex is the main place that we're thinking about, it's a little simplistic. We think the cerebellum in the back does some things too. But let's talk about the components. So you're familiar with attention, sustained focus. Working memory is the ability to hold information in your mind and manipulate it. So if I gave everyone a phone number right now to put in your phone, you would hear me, you would listen, you would put it in your phone, and you might not remember it ever again. So it's just pieces of information you can hold in your mind and manipulate. Monitoring is the awareness of the impact of your behavior on others, as well as assessing your own performance during or shortly after finishing a task. Initiation is getting started independently. beginning a task. Inhibition is the ability to stop an action, control impulsivity. Planning and organizational skills are your ability to plan ahead, be efficient, organize your materials, turn in work on time. Cognitive flexibility is the ability to be flexible with changes in plans or schedule, transitions, compromise, coming up with alternate ways to solve a problem. And then emotional control is emotional regulation. I had a mentor, I guess a decade ago now, who gave me the example of a grocery store. I think it's helpful because we've all probably been in a grocery store. So you can think of it in your mind. It is very well structured. You have the produce and the frozen aisle and the dairy. So you can think about the structure of a grocery store. And then we can bring almost any executive skill in that. So let's say I enter the grocery store and I have good planning and organizational skills. I am getting my lettuce, cucumber, and tomatoes. Then I am going to get my milk and yogurt, and then I'll get my frozen vegetables. I am using the structure of the store efficiently and checking out. I come in with poor planning and organizational skills. I might get some lettuce and then go get some cheese, and then I'm like, oh, I forgot my cucumbers, and then I go get my milk, and I am taking maybe twice as long. I get it done. It's just not as efficient, right? So that I don't know if that resonates with anyone here. How about with cognitive flexibility? So you go into the grocery store, I am going to make an apple pie tonight. You look and the apples don't look good. They are bad apples. You have poor cognitive flexibility, you might leave. Like, that was my plan. I can't think of an alternate way to solve it. If you have good cognitive flexibility skills, you might say, oh, actually, there's peaches. They look beautiful. I'm going to find a recipe on my phone for them and I'll purchase that. How about inhibitory control? You get to the checkout, you know why the candy's there, right? It's for us who are disinhibited and get that candy as you leave the store. It's also really important when I talk about attention and executive functioning with families, I also talk about how it's so intertwined with emotional functioning. If I go into the grocery store angry, hungry, sad, frustrated, I might not be as efficient, right? My systems can override each other. I'm not going to utilize the structure as the store as I usually do because my mind is elsewhere. So that's also really important to think about. Another area of functioning that we look at are speech and language skills. So speech is the articulation as well as the prosody and fluency, that intonation. Is it robotic? Is it appropriate? Fluency, the smoothness, not halting. Language has two components. The receptive is the understanding and comprehension. The expressive is what you say. So the structure, the vocabulary, grammar, and syntax, I think of language as kind of two components: the core, that overall structure and organization, and then the higher order skills, which is pragmatics. That's the social use of language, the verbal reasoning, the language organization. Then we have visual thinking or nonverbal reasoning. That's basic visual perception of shapes and objects. Also, the organization for complex information. One of our tasks is to copy a very complicated picture that has many integrated parts, and we see how do you organize such complex information. Constructional ability, paper and pencil tasks, puzzles, and spatial orientation. In understanding motor skills, I would say the majority of neuropsychologists will focus on the fine motor skills, not necessarily the gross motor skills. We definitely observe it. I will make sure I'm watching a child as they're walking, so I'm seeing their gait. But it's not something I would go into a lot of detailed testing, and I'd probably refer to a physical therapist or a medical doctor. Fine motor skills, I'm looking at speed and control as well as graphomotor abilities. In learning and memory, I'm looking at many different pieces. How do you take in information, consolidate it? How do you retrieve it long term? So I'm giving you something to remember, and I will ask you about it in 25 minutes. And your ability to learn from repeated exposure. Also, I'm checking to see about your efficiency with learning information. So, for example, I do two different tasks: a structured verbal task of memory, and then a or one that's less structured. So, I'm going to give you a story to remember. A story has context. I read the story out loud to you. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. That is more structured information to remember over time. Then I'm giving you a random list of words to remember. There's not much structure there, right? How do you do between these two types of information? In the word list, I also repeat it. Do you get more words each time on each trial? Then I do a recognition trial. Now I'm asking you multiple choice questions about that story. Maybe you remembered a little bit when I just said, tell me what you remember, but now you remember everything when I give you multiple choice questions. That shows me that maybe you had a little bit of a inefficient way to take in and store the information, but when I gave you the structure of it, you remembered it. It wasn't a memory problem. It was more an executive issue. And then we look at academic skills, the reading and math and writing. With reading, there's multiple components we're looking at: decoding, single word reading, fluency and comprehension, mathematics, the automaticity of facts, calculation skills and word problems, and then with writing, spelling, as well as composition. In terms of social skills, we're looking at, again, several components here: the nonverbal communication, gestures, body language, but also how do we understand the nonverbal communication of others? Reciprocal engagement. So, how are you with conversation back and forth, with play back and forth? And understanding of relationships. What is a friend? What is not a friend? In emotional functioning, I'm looking at your understanding of emotional vocabulary and how you can describe your feelings. Also, the physical manifestation of the feelings. Do you know what it feels like when you're happy, sad, nervous, scared? Um, Mood states, tell me about your mood, and we go through questionnaires and also interview, as well as your thought process and content. So that was a little bit about all the pieces that we're looking at. And now, who should go through this? Who benefits from a neuropsychological evaluation? A lot of people can. Children with medical conditions, neurodevelopmental differences, or emotional functioning challenges. These are just some examples. Epilepsy, traumatic brain injury, genetic disorders, autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, anxiety, mood disorders, but there could be many other individuals on this list. I like to tell families, if you're wondering about waiting or pursuing an assessment, or when is a good time to seek one out, consider these 3 questions. Have the concerns persisted for more than 6 months? Have others noticed these issues, like teachers, doctors, other professionals? Are the concerns affecting your child's academic progress, social success, or emotional well being? If any of the questions that here the answer is yes, it might be a sign that your child could benefit from a neuropsychological evaluation. But let's say all the answers are no, but you still feel that something is going on that you want an answer to, still reach out and ask those questions. I find parents' intuition to be super spot on. So ask the questions, and it's always good to ask and find out a little more information to discuss options. I'm going to take a sip of water here. Mm. Oh, I thought everyone was taking pictures of me. Okay, no, just kidding. Yes, so all of this will be available for you. You could also go to intervention first before assessment. So this could be one option if your child is experiencing some challenges, to pursue intervention before the extensive evaluation. Your child has struggles with math. Maybe a math tutor would be involved. There's a lot of anxiety. You can go directly to a psychologist for an anxiety intervention. You could meet with a pediatrician or psychiatrist to discuss medication options. However, sometimes, not all the time, starting with an intervention without knowing the origin of the challenges could negatively impact the treatment success. It wouldn't mean that it would be hurtful or damaging by any means. It just might be slow, and then you might not know, or it might not give you the outcome that you're looking for. So you track progress and ask questions. Hey, we've been doing this for a year, not much movement. What should we do next? Another option could be to seek out an assessment through a public school setting which can be very helpful, but there are some key differences between what a neuropsychological evaluation and the psychoeducation or school-based assessment can provide. So I put together this little table for us to look at about some of the differences. So the purpose of a school-based assessment would be to determine eligibility for school services and to provide support and accommodations in the school setting. A neuropsychological evaluation is much more broad. It's to identify strengths and challenges and provide diagnostic clarification and guide treatment. The evaluator is in a school assessment is a school psychologist who could have a doctoral or a master's degree. It's special education staff, sometimes including a speech language therapist, occupational therapist. In a neuropsychological evaluation, it would be a neuropsychologist who specializes in brain-based behavior. A school assessment does not give a diagnosis. They give a educational classification. So just keep that in mind. But a neuropsychological evaluation would give a diagnosis. The scope, as I just said, in the school is much more limited. It is focused on school, of course. The academic and cognitive abilities, it can also include speech and language testing and testing of motor skills. Neuropsychological evaluation, like I said, we just went through this, is much more comprehensive. The recommendations in a school assessment would focus on the school, right? It's what you need in the classroom and support within the school. A neuropsychological evaluation would focus on all interventions required in school and outside. Big piece, though, is the cost is free in the school setting, where a neuropsychological evaluation can vary. Insurance can cover it, and there are some providers that take insurance, but there are also many providers that are out of network, and you have to get a reimbursement, and that can be a large cost. There, like I just said, there are several types of school-based assessments. So there are the psychoeducational, which is the cognitive and academic, but also occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech and language therapy evaluations, and functional behavior assessments. This is where somebody comes in to do a structured observation if there is a behavior regulation challenge to put in place a plan of action for behavior. How do you request this assessment from school? Well, the first is to send a letter to the principal and special educator and an email. I want it so you have a timestamp. You want to see like when it was sent because there is a certain amount of time. It's different for every single district of when they have to respond to you. So having that timestamp is really important so you can refer back to that. And you're going to include relevant information about challenges going on in the school as well as any documentation from outside providers that you have. The National Dissemination Center for Children with Disabilities has a sample letter that you are welcome to copy and paste and just put in your information. So if you're looking for that, and parent training centers can be helpful. Also, this group can be very helpful. I'm sure there are many resources within SPED NET as well. Advocating in the school can be a complicated process. What we want to find out, does your child qualify for formal accommodations or interventions in the form of these pieces, the 504 plan or the IEP, the Individualized Education Program? Let's say the answer is yes, they qualify. Then you want to know, how are we tracking progress with the goals? Who is the one tracking it? How will it be tracked? And when will you get to see this data so you can understand it yourself? Also, how often are you checking in with the group and meeting? You want to have all this information so you can be the best advocate that you can. I think that Wright's Law has a lot of really good information. Are people pretty familiar with Wright's Law? Yeah. No. It's a website that was really, I think it's the law. It was a couple who are both lawyers. Is that right? Yes. Speech pathologist. Okay. I've gone to one of their conferences and they're great speakers as well. It's helpful resources for parents, but really for everybody. I think as a professional, I get a lot of great information as I'm not a lawyer. So I think I look there as well for special education law and advocacy. And it can be really helpful. There's probably a question you have is going to be answered on this website. There are some circumstances where a district would pay for a private neuropsychological evaluation, but it can be a long process to get there. This is obviously the district doesn't want to pay for a private neuropsychological evaluation. So, really, the circumstances that it often would happen is maybe after a school assessment has been completed and you disagree with the results, or they fail to evaluate your child appropriately. Maybe they just reviewed the old testing, they're not assessing the area of suspected disability, and then you can argue that this was not done as it should have been. This is called an IEE, an independent educational evaluation. Even if the IEE is granted, it's also important to note that the schools are not required to put in place everything that a neuropsychological evaluation recommends. That's actually important for us to know, even about any private neuropsychological evaluation. You bring it to school, they don't have to say, okay, done, I'm going to do it all. They could argue with some of those findings. So you decide we're going to pursue an assessment. How do you talk to your child about this? I recommend always using their words. So, you know how you mentioned that you got really bored in math class? Remember when you shared with me how hard it is for you to make friends? I know you told me that you hate being chosen to read aloud in class because you think it's so difficult. So, whatever you've heard from your kid, use that. It's powerful when it comes from them. And then you share that you've listened and now you want to come up with a plan. Well, I listened and I found someone who's going to help us figure out why this is going on and then come up with a plan to make things easier. We're going to make a plan for you to understand your amazing brain and a plan for homeschool and any other supports you might need. For younger ones, or maybe even some older ones, you also want to explain what kind of doctor they're seeing. I often have to say, I am not giving shots. That's not the kind of doctor I am. So it's not like they're pediatrician. I call myself a thinking doctor. I look at how young people think and learn through a lot of different activities. I also don't call it games because sometimes kids come in thinking it will be a little bit different than it is. Discussing the things that could happen. You're going to be in the office with the doctor doing activities at a desk. Some things will be like school, like math and reading, and some things will be brand new, puzzles and patterns and drawing and answering questions. Some things will be easier and some things will be more challenging, but you don't need to prepare it all. We're just looking at how you think and how you learn, and there's nothing to prepare for. Just how you are is great. Evaluations are for all ages, so I often will tell children some of the questions I'm asking you, I even ask to adults. So it's not about knowing all the answers, and some don't even have right answers. It's about what information you can give me, and if you make a guess, that's awesome because then I can see your thought process there too. And then whatever questions they have, what do they want to know and what do they want to learn? What happens in the feedback session? This is the time where you get to hear all the results verbally from the provider. Apparent feedback can, again, range maybe from one provider to the next, but it's usually about 1 to 2 hours. And I think many providers are offering virtual or in person parent feedback sessions where the testing is often in person. Mostly, I don't know many who work with children who do that much virtual testing at this point. You review the results of the evaluation, discuss diagnoses if there are any, and then go over recommendations and treatment plan. I myself offer a shorter session, about 30 minutes, a few weeks later after you get the written report in your hand to give you time to process, take in the information, because it's hard to think of questions in the moment when you're getting spewing all this information at you from a doctor. So I like giving families the opportunity to take time. The report might come up with questions, and then we can talk again. Some types of treatment or intervention that might be recommended after a neuropsychological evaluation will include school-based supports and interventions like a 504 plan or an IEP, therapeutic interventions like working with a psychologist or a social worker, a speech language therapist, occupational or physical therapist, maybe tutoring or executive functioning coaching, medication consultation. Neuropsychologists are not medical doctors. They would not prescribe medication, but they would give you the research to say, oh, this diagnosis actually has been shown to benefit from medication. So you might want to talk to a medical provider to see if that would be appropriate for your child. In a child feedback, this might not be a part of all evaluations, but I recommend that it should be. This is, I would say our field has shifted a little bit. It used to be that first we never gave feedback to the client at all. We just told doctors what was going on with the client. Not helpful, right? That's not supportive. Then we told just the parents because they're the ones who are going to help their kid. Now we're like, oh, actually, we want the kid. As the introductions to this is this talk from SPED NET was we want the kids to become their best advocates, right? So we need them to learn about how their brain works and how they think and learn. I would say my feedback with kids is much shorter, maybe 10 to 15 minutes. With an older adolescent, I can go a little bit longer. It can be completed with or without a parent, virtual or in person. And I will recommend that it provides something tangible that can be looked at later. What I do is do a PowerPoint presentation. I'll give you an example of one of the ones I do, and then I ask the parent to print out the slides and review it maybe in a week with the child, for the child to bring this to therapy with them so they could review that together. So something tangible. I have a colleague, actually my co-author, she writes a letter to the child. So again, something tangible that they can look at later. There's another professional in the field that has a book that they go through with the child and they write in their strengths and challenges. And there was a really interesting research study that they created personalized fables with the child's neuropsychological results, and they gave that to the child, which I thought was kind of cool. But what you want to do is give this information and provide developmentally appropriate resources. This is my little shout out to my book series. This is a book series for elementary age kids to understand their diagnoses. My colleague and I wrote it because we give resources all the time and we couldn't find what we were looking for elementary age kids to understand their diagnoses. There are amazing books about symptoms. So, I read my son the Personal Space Camp book all the time by Julia Cook because talking about personal space, it's so great and helpful. But talking specifically about a diagnosis, we couldn't find exactly what we were looking for. And so we composed these two books, ADHD and Different Thinkers ADHD, Different Thinkers Autism. And then our next book, Different Thinkers Dyslexia, will be out next year. So here's an example of a child feedback. If we can go through that of my PowerPoint slides. I'm going to take one more sip. So this is what I would present to a kiddo. I always start by telling them, before I even get to the first slide, which is strengths, what do you think I'm going to say are your strengths, and hear from them and get some information, because I said, yes, they are. When I go through strengths, they're not always quantifiable. I want to talk about all strengths that a child experiences. These can be artistic, athletic, kindness, personality characteristics. So things that I heard from other people, from them, from what I saw in my session. This child, you're an amazing big brother, you're an excellent friend, you're a fantastic baseball player, and you're so creative and love to do crafts. And then I also saw these awesome strengths in testing. And I go through them. Oh, your language skills were so great. Word definition, saying how words are alike, understanding language, picture naming, amazing visual thinking skills like your puzzles and patterns, excellent drawing skills. I found that you really learn best when there's context. You did so amazing when I read you a story versus a random list of words. Your math skills were exceptional, both with calculations and word problems and when you had to do them fast. You have awesome social skills. You're an amazing friend, and you are such a happy kid. I'm also going to talk about things that were harder for you because we all have things that are easier and harder. What do you think I'm going to say? I hear from them, and then I go through challenges. I always keep the challenges to maybe 2 to 3, so much less than the strengths. And I put them into categories. For this child, it was paying attention and putting the brakes on and reading. So I used their words again. You said that it can be hard to focus in class. You shared that your body needs to move more than others, and it can be challenging to sit still. And testing saw that too. You told me that you don't really like to read and you have hard time sounding out the words. I also saw that in testing. And when we put this together, there's a name for it, and it's called ADHD and dyslexia. So then I introduce the diagnostic names, and then I go through some famous people who have talked about their diagnoses. I'm not sure if people are aware, but Simone Biles, Michael Phelps, Michael Jordan and Sir Richard Branson have all talked about ADHD and how it has had some challenges, but also some gifts that come along with the profile. Anderson Cooper, Orlando Bloom, and Sir Richard Branson again have talked about their dyslexia. Again, how challenges have come with the profile, but also some strengths. That's where I go to talk about how there are strengths also associated with this profile. Like in dyslexia, there's research to show there's stronger visual spatial skills in these kiddos. There's stronger problem solving skills and creativity in ADHD and dyslexia. Entrepreneurship, like setting up a business, actually, there's a really high number of CEOs who have ADHD because of this cool strength. And also being able to develop an interest into a future job. Then I go through recommendations, school, outside of school, and resources that would be appropriate. So, how do we interpret this data? You should not have to. Okay, I'm gonna go through what the numbers mean, but I also want to make it clear that that's not your job. That's like what we went to school for, is to understand this information. But when you get the report, it can be really helpful to have a little bit of an understanding of what this all means. But it should be on the provider to be explaining this to you through the written word and going through that together. So the feedback and written report should go over everything, but it might still be interesting to understand that test summary page with all the numbers. These are really meant for professionals to review, and I even include a disclaimer in my reports where I say this is really meant for the convenience of other professionals. Please don't interpret this without any meaningful other data in mind, because again, numbers without the behavioral observations could not be helpful at times. But let's go through it so you know, if you ever see this, some ideas about it. This is the table that I'll put at the top of my test summary sheet. It talks about the 4 different types of scores that I have on my tests. These are called standard scores, scaled scores, T-scores, and Z-scores. The mean is different for every single one. So the standard score of 100, this is a common score for like an IQ test. But a scaled score, the mean is 10. The average score is 10. For a T-score, the average score is 50. And for a Z, it's 0. Then we look at the standard deviation, which is how different the score is from average. Standard score, the standard deviation is 15. Scaled score, it's 3. T-score, 10. And Z-score, 1. So that's already in itself complicated. I'm giving you so many different scores with so many different patterns that we're looking for. These are normed scores based on testing many individuals to get the age or grade appropriate values. So a raw score means nothing until you compare it to the normative data. So the raw score is, oh, you got 6 of these items correct. But what does that mean? Nothing until I look at how many other kids got 6 correct who are 8 years, 10 months, whatever that is. So we need some meaningful interpretation. Percentiles are also sometimes included in reports, and this is the percentage of individuals who, in the normative sample, who scored lower than the individual who is being evaluated. So a percentile rank of 34 indicates that the individual's score was higher than 34% of their same age peers. It is not the percent correct or incorrect. So just keeping that in mind, 40th percentile is still average. That doesn't mean you failed a test. It actually is in the average range. The average range is between the 25th and 75th percentile, and I'll show you a picture of that. It also is not equal interval measurement. The difference between a 50th and a 60th percentile represents a much smaller gap than the 10th and the 20th. So keep this in mind. Percentiles are not percentage correct. The American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology came out with descriptive labels that they wanted everyone to use the same. Because when you get a neuropsych report, actually everyone reports these scores a little bit differently. They might have a label of above average or below average. And so they came up with these ranges. So you see average 90 to 109, high average 110 to 119, and then all of these ranges. However, the next year, They came up with a research article that said it's actually not as helpful and it's not as beneficial because it's still confusing. So we haven't quite created the exact way to describe all of these. When I talk about a score, I'll talk about the average range, above the average range, below the average range, and then I'll get into that a little bit more. Even more confusing is the tests themselves have their own descriptive labels. These are 4 different measures with the exact same scores, but the descriptive label is different on every single one. So, what does this mean then? Just remember that the average range is between the 25th and 75th percentile. Below average is below the 25th percentile. Above average is above the 75th percentile. And ask questions when you're interpreting these scores. Is everyone familiar with the bell curve? Yeah? So this is what I'm talking about here, is if you see, let's say we're talking about the standard score. So the mean is 100, if you see it right here. Up 15, down 15. So that's from 85 to 115. We have 68% of our population. That is the average range, is right there. Now, if you look down for scaled score, that's the average is 10, down 3, up 3, same. Look at the T-score, the average is 50, down 10, up 10. So that's what we're thinking about with this bell curve. And the percentiles is the 25th to the 75th percentile again. And you see much less people at the tails. So 2% below the standard score of 70, 2% above the standard score of 130. So at the tails are much less individuals. I thought I'd go through a few random examples that are a mixture of many different children I've seen over 15 years of working, I guess. So we could just look at some of these. So this is from WISC, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. This is an IQ measure that's quite commonly used. This is the 5th edition. You see there are 5 index scores and a full scale score. These are standard scores. Then there are scaled scores. That's a different number. I know, this is so confusing. That are these, so the standard scores mean 100, scaled scores mean 10. So when you look at this, if you were to interpret it, you can look at the full scale IQ and you see a 124 or the 95th percentile. This is above average. This is a bright kiddo. Then you look at all the other scores and you see, oh, they range from a 105 to a 130. Is that mean that the full scale IQ is not valid? No, it's still valid and interpretable. So that score is still where they're at. But we now have a pattern of strengths and challenges that we want to think about when we're considering interventions, accommodations, etc. That being said, you have no idea how this kid performed. Were they throwing the pencil at me during these tasks, or were they sitting nicely? This data doesn't tell you that. So that's another important thing that we always need to keep in mind. The data tells us one story. When I actually look at these scores, my testing manual will tell me the significant discrepancies between them, and none of the base rates were below 10%. So even though there is a big range from 105 to 130, this actually is a common variability that we see in many people in the population. For example, the difference between that verbal comprehension index of 130 and the 105 processing speed happens in about 41% of the population. So even though that's such a huge difference, it's actually not uncommon to see such a big difference there. So while it's not significant, it can still impact the child. So I want to look at other speeded tests. So if the processing is average, so it's not below average, but it is a little different, how are this child's other processing speed tasks if that score was actually as it is and there wasn't some other behavioral component that came up? And then you can look at the subtest scores and are there any discrepancies among those? And actually there were not. So we would say, yeah, there's a relative strength in verbal reasoning, maybe a relative weakness in processing speed. Let's look at the other data to see how that plays out for this child. This is a young adult. So this is a test, the same Wechsler measure, but now for adults. So it's called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And for this individual, you look at the numbers and see they're quite different than my last slide. So the full scale IQ is now below 70, it's 68. And there is some discrepancy here as well, but the overall scores are in the below average range. And then we look and interpret all of the pieces here. You also, if you're thinking about does this individual meet criteria for a diagnosis of intellectual developmental disorder, or what we used to call intellectual disability, you would have to do adaptive testing as well, which I did for this individual. And they did meet criteria for that diagnosis based on both of those items. How about academic scores? So you look at these academic abilities. This individual had some variability, but you see a lot of reading scores that are weaker. The letter single word reading, the passage comprehension, the GORT, this measure. So this is called the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement. The GORT is the gray oral reading test. You're reading aloud, and so I can hear your fluency and how you sound things out. And you can see the percentile ranks are quite low here. This child did have a diagnosis of a learning disorder with impairment in reading. What was really interesting is I tested them during the summer, but the school website talked about how they actually have a literacy approach with balancing, how they taught reading was with the balanced literacy approach. And I'm not sure if people are aware, but that is a debunked theory of how to learn to read, which doesn't use phonics, it uses guessing. And so I was trying to find out from the family more, and they weren't aware, and I couldn't talk to school. But if that was true, and that this child had never been taught phonics, I said I'd like them to come back. If they do get taught phonics and then suddenly skyrocket in skills, I would take away that diagnosis, because really it was actually a fault of the learning process versus a dyslexia diagnosis. It's a really interesting story if people are wanting to look into that more. There was a great podcast about this. Do you know the name? Or uh, it was so good that talked about the history of it. A journalist put it together, and it was really fascinating to hear about. But I don't think many programs in this area use this debunked theory, thank goodness. But if your child is not learning phonics, ask questions, find out more. This is another child who actually had really excellent abilities across the board in academic achievement. You can see that the lowest score happens to be in math facts fluency. It's still average. A 102 is still an average score, but a little bit lower than some other scores. This child actually ended up also having a diagnosis of ADHD, and we know that automaticity is a challenge in individuals with ADHD, which can lead to weaknesses in doing math facts quickly. So learning facts quickly. I don't know if you've seen adults ever have to use their fingers to count the tip at the end of a meal. They may have had a history of ADHD, perhaps. What's interesting is that rating scales do not use a bell curve. They actually are not on a bell curve. So the percentile ranks are a little bit different for a questionnaire that's completed by parents and teachers. This is the brief. It's a questionnaire that looks at attention and executive functioning. What we're looking at here is a T-score that's above 65, usually, to see if there is impairment. So for this individual, you can see that there are differences between parent and teacher report, but they both agree in challenges with inhibitory control, because both of those are above 65, if you see that. But the teacher also concerned with other things like self-monitoring, cognitive flexibility, which is shift, that scale, emotional regulation, attention and working memory. So what does this mean is I want to find out more what is different between home and school. There often is differences for sure. And in this case, it was the home allowed for less demands for this child. So the school was much more demanding, and it was harder for them with executive skills there. More distractions, a lot of different things. Another questionnaire that we give, this one's more about social, emotional, and behavioral functioning, called the BASC. This can be a very confusing one to interpret because scores up to learning problems, we're looking at if they're above 65, there is maybe an area of challenge. But then adaptability, social skills, leadership, study skills, activities, daily living, and functional communication, we're looking for scores below 40 as a problem. So, again, why you don't need to be the ones to interpret this, but just to keep that in mind if you're interested, we're looking at these differences. This, again, is a different report from parent to teacher. It's also important, there's validity scales in our questionnaires to make sure that people are reading through them and not just rushing through. So we throw in some questions like the child can count to 3, and in a 16-year-old, I once had a teacher say no, and I said, oh, that's interesting, and maybe they were kind of rushing through it. So we look at some validity scores. Also, there's a score to see if someone's over-reporting negative symptoms. So are they seeing this child overly negative? And this is not a very common experience. So we can see some of those things too. The social responsiveness scale is looking at social functioning. And again, we're looking at a score above 65, a T-score above 65, which is a standard deviation and a half to see about challenges. If you can see here, while there are some differences, most people are saying that there are challenges with this individual, and this was actually an autistic child. So I just told you about the numbers. They are very important and helpful, but they do not tell you the whole story. That's an important piece of this. A lower score in a measure could be a true deficit, or it could be due to a lack of attention, test anxiety, and interfering behavior. Like during a processing speed task, sometimes kids want to talk to me and have a full conversation. I said, no, keep going. Like, do what you're doing. You're being timed. So you need to take this in and make sure that you're interpreting all of the information. The possibility of poor effort can also happen for many different reasons. Is the child completely available for testing that day? And they're not really paying attention because they're upset that they're there and they didn't want to be there. And we figured this all out together. A high score on a measure can sometimes also mask challenges. For example, a child who can score well on the writing samples task from the Woodcock-Johnson sometimes can still struggle with written expression because spelling errors, capitalization, punctuation are not counted for that particular test. So again, we need to understand the test itself and the data and the behavioral observations, not just look at the numbers. All right, so let's go through a few concluding remarks. I think I put too many words on the slide, so let me walk through it. So when you go through an assessment with school, outside of school, in a hospital, wherever you're doing it, you should leave a feedback session knowing if the provider thinks they accurately captured your child's profile, or if there were things like interfering behaviors that negatively impacted performance, and they maybe represent an underestimate of your child's potential. You should leave knowing your child's pattern of strengths and challenges. Make sure strengths are discussed because that is something you want to keep reviewing, supporting, developing. It's not just all about challenges, but you need to know those too, 100%, because those are the things that can impact the child's academic, social, emotional, and that's where you want to intervene as well. You want to leave knowing if there's a diagnosis or diagnoses, and what are they? You want to leave knowing what are the priority recommendations that you want to put in place right away. Maybe you hang up on this call. Who should I be calling to get on a wait list or whatever it might be? That could include any referrals, maybe names of therapists they want you to contact, or you should write a letter to school to set up an appointment about an IEP. An evaluation from school or outside of school offers a lot of information to process and take in. Following the feedback session, you're going to get a written report. You take some time to review it. It can be quite long. It's even more information than maybe you got in that phone call or that virtual meeting. Take time to review it. Make sure the information is accurate and in line with what you thought was being discussed in the verbal feedback. Look at the recommendations and see if they make sense to you. Maybe something was not discussed and you're like, we didn't even talk about that intervention. Make sure that you feel comfortable with this report because a lot of times you're going to share it with many different people. If you come up with more questions, you don't understand something, you're confused about the data analysis, reach out and ask questions. That's really important. That is what this provider should be helping you with. Request additional time, make sure your questions are answered because you are the most important person who's going to be supporting your child. There are so many different ways to get support for your kid. Figuring out the path that's correct for you, it can be daunting because there's so many different paths to take. A neuropsych assessment or a psychoeducational evaluation can be helpful, but it's not needed for everybody. So, think about monitoring your concerns over time. One of my favorite parent hacks, I don't know if other people do that, is I have a concern and then I put something on my calendar for about 2 to 3 months from now. I'm concerned about this. And then when it comes up 2 to 3 months from now, am I still concerned about it or am I not anymore? I think this just happened to me a few months ago. I was concerned about snoring in one of my kids, and it's not a concern anymore. I'm like, okay, that's great. Reach out to other trusted professionals. You can talk to your pediatrician, to teachers, other individuals involved in your child's care. Ask questions, be curious, make sure you're being heard, and review all options. And if plan A is not working, you started with this path, don't worry. Reevaluate, come up with a plan B. This is my contact information. I think I put a few cards back there. I have my private practice in Scarsdale, and my co-author and I have an Instagram account where we give some just more evidence-based information for parents to access about different diagnoses and testing. And you can follow us if you'd like. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Thank you. I would love to hear if you have any questions. It's so interesting. I'm on this legislative committee right now at the New York State's Neuropsychological Association. It was so great that dyslexia is now covered as of January 1st. However, we still haven't figured out what dyslexia testing entails to be covered. So will they cover a full neuropsych? It's still being debated actually right now. So it's amazing, and I'm hoping that this is great and going to change, but yeah.
And I just want to say, related to that, the podcast
Oh,
that
yes.
you brought up, it's called Sold a Story.
Yes,
It's
yes.
American Public Media, and it's a documentary podcast about reading curriculum, the history of reading curriculum in the United States, and changes that happened over time, and how it actually degraded, and our children were not learning to read. So I highly recommend you listen to it. It's called Sold a Story.
It's very interesting. Yeah. I think, did you have a question? Yes.
Dyslexia, this might be something I could very easily Google, so I apologize. Is dysgraphia part of dyslexia? Does it fall under the same?
They are two separate diagnoses.
Okay.
Actually, just to let you know, neither of them are in the DSM-5, which is the manual I use and I would bill under for insurance. They are actually, dysgraphia is now, it's a motor challenge with writing, and we call it developmental coordination disorder. Dyslexia is an issue with reading. We call it specific learning disorder with impairment in reading. Could individuals have both of those? Yes, for sure. And they do often come together, but they are two separate diagnoses. Yes.
Thanks. I was wondering, I saw that TBI, traumatic brain injuries, is one of the things you diagnose. And I have two small kids. We know a few friends who have fallen and had concussions. How do you know, or does it matter, if something is ADHD versus, oh, this probably was a concussion that wasn't caught?
I apologize that there maybe I wrote this wrong. I would not diagnose a TBI.
Okay.
Someone would come to me with a concussion,
Okay.
and then I could do testing. Now, a concussion is a mild TBI. So
Mhm.
this is a traumatic brain injury that is recovered within a few weeks. So if I'm seeing someone for testing, I'd probably say, "You just had a concussion last week? let's not do our comprehensive evaluation today. Maybe that's something we think about for the future. But it should not be that the concussion has long-lasting impact. It should be recovered, but if you still have attention and executive functioning challenges a year later after you had a concussion, uh, if you have a moderate to severe TBI, that is not a concussion anymore. That means you had a significant brain injury. That's a whole different story. But from a concussion, you should no longer be exhibiting those symptoms. Many kids who get concussions have ADHD. Is that surprising? Probably not. If you think about how concussions can happen, it's usually very active individuals who might run into something or do something that's maybe without putting the brakes on or something like that. So it's not uncommon that we see someone who has a history of a concussion who also has ADHD. Yeah.
I wanted to ask more about the IEE, like currently going through this kid who was identified in preschool with needing help. Depending on who you ask, autism level 1, which I can see, or ADHD, which also I can see. Also, this child is like extremely gifted in math, currently in 4th grade, doing like literally trigonometry. He's always had an IEP. He's doing the school called for an outside evaluator
Okay.
because he's struggling with OCD at the beginning of this year, which since he's gotten under control and is doing better, but it was just too much for him. But like last year he got a comprehensive test with his IEP through the school, like just the school staff doing it like they do every 3 years. He just had his neuropsych evaluation, but it seemed like a Walmart version of what you described, like of what, like they watched him for an hour at school, they talked to teachers, and they saw him a total of 1 hour.
Oh.
And so I was wondering, should I have expected something different? Because I thought it was going to be more like what you described.
So I guess it depends what kind of assessment they are going to pay for. Maybe that they were just looking for a clinical psychologist to come in to do observation and understanding of anxiety. I don't know.
It's a psychiatrist and
Or a psychiatrist. So a
yeah.
psychiatrist is a medical doctor. They would not be doing a neuropsychological evaluation.
Okay.
So it sounds like that the school paid for a very specific service. So that is the service you receive, but maybe not the one you wanted. And then you can definitely say, oh, but we didn't look at this or this or this. And then you can find out more.
I feel like he's a complex kid, like overall super happy kid, but like he's I feel like they were missing a lot, and they put down a diagnosis that when I asked about it and like sent them an email with the criteria, because it to me obviously didn't fit my kid, and it's not like I'm like not my kid, he is several diagnoses, and then they changed it to like a very nondescript disorder. Like I just feel like wasn't
if it doesn't
enough.
feel right to you, you have all the you could look into advocates for yourself. I think this organization can definitely help you. You could go due process. You can say this isn't what we needed. We don't agree. We want to take our next steps to figure out what is the correct course of action for our child. So you have a lot of options. You don't have to accept what is given to you. If you don't agree with those results, ask questions and raise your voice for
Can
sure.
I request like a full neuropsych with what you were describing?
You
Like,
could.
but
Will they give it to you? It depends. I think if you have all the data in front of you and you say, this isn't what I see, you didn't look at this area of functioning, which I see as a big area of deficit, and then maybe you get an advocate to also support you through this process, then you might have a better chance of the school being more available for that.
right, thank you.
But it is a process. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I recommend using this organization.
Yeah, I was just going to say, SPED NET, we will meet individually with parents and go through your IEP and your testing, because each of us and others in our organization have a lot of experience I mean, I used to do child welfare research. I've reviewed hundreds and hundreds of baths and Weschlers and right. But we can look everything over with you and then make some recommendations that either you can take directly to the school or we can provide you with a list of potential advocates. And sometimes just having an advocate in the room who really gets the language and the process at a level that lay people don't is helpful. But you can just reach out to us individually.
And it sounds like you might need an advocate. He sounds like he's twice exceptional, right? And so that makes things more complicated, right, and involved. We do have a video of an IEE webinar on our website.
Oh,
If
fantastic.
if you check your name in the back, I'll send it to you directly.
So my question is, um, my son had an evaluation when he was 5 and got services, for years. Now he's 15, and obviously his needs are different. So is this a kind of evaluation that we should be looking at, or is something different?
Thank you so much. So when I do an evaluation neuropsych with a child, I don't always see them again. So like school with an IEP, every 3 years there's a check-in. You don't necessarily have the same need for a neuropsychological evaluation unless you are not getting what you need and new concerns have come about. So at the age of 15, if your child gets access to all the services he requires, is in all the therapies he needs, and is doing quite well, you probably don't need to search out a comprehensive assessment like that. But if new things have come up, there are now new challenges. The IEP is not helpful anymore. These services are, the progress has slowed. There's something new in their life and a medical condition, whatever it might be, then you might want to pursue an updated evaluation. So it's really are your needs being met or are they not? And then you look into the only time when I would say differently is if a young person wants accommodations on standardized tests like the ACT, SAT, or college accommodations. They all require updated testing within 2 years, something like that. So that's kind of an exceptional circumstance.
What is the school required to provide, I guess, versus what you have to go outside of the school for as far as a neuropsych test? And I'll just give you context, I guess. I have a daughter in second grade, and we suspect dyslexia, but she's been getting services through the school, but it doesn't seem to be entirely
Formal, like a IEP?
Not quite, but I think we're at that point. So what is the school required? What are we kind of, I guess, entitled to ask for? And then, as far as age goes, if you feel like you're not getting what you need, when do you go outside of the school and do something more like this?
I wish I had a simple answer to give you. The requirement is the FAPE, right? The free access to public education for all. So everyone is supposed to receive access to public education no matter what services or accommodations or interventions you need. That is supposed to be. What does that mean for every individual is going to be so different, and how it's interpreted and how the school sees things. Maybe they say, oh, but she's doing fine. So like, no, we don't need to do anything. She's doing fine. But you realize she's quite behind. You're seeing her deteriorate. Her emotional functioning is being impacted. So that's when you might see things that you want to bring to school and advocate and say, you have been providing these informal interventions for a year. The progress is limited. She's still struggling. She hates school now, whatever. I don't know, whatever you want to say. I need a formal assessment. We need to put in place formal interventions for her. If they say no, that's when you decide what your next path is going to be. Am I going to go private? Am I going to get an advocate? Am I going to argue against school? But unfortunately, I don't have a great answer of what school is required because it's so different how they interpret that information of what the child's capable of. So when do you go private is totally up to you. I've had some individuals who don't go through school at all and just go straight to me. It's a personal choice and decision about if you are really stuck and the school is not giving you what you need and you want to ask questions elsewhere.
So could I just follow on?
Of course, please do. Yes.
So there's no requirement for them to provide a neuro exam like this through the school.
Oh, schools do not do neuropsychological evaluations. They're not required to do any evaluations unless they determine that this is impacting. So you can say, you all can tell school something's going on. What can we do? How do we assess this? They could say we don't even need an assessment because she's doing fine. They could say, oh yeah, let's do a assessment in school to understand this more. And they could say, oh, we're putting in place these informal interventions and we're going to reassess in a year and then maybe we'll do an assessment then. So they don't really necessarily have to say one thing. They do not give a diagnosis. So if you're looking for the diagnosis of dyslexia, you wouldn't get it through school, but you could get an educational coding, a federal classification of a specific learning disability. But if you're wanting that specific diagnosis, that would be a private assessment.
Thank you.
It's complicated. I wish it was not.
Okay. So I have a question. And following up on your question is that I feel, and I've experienced that the school is not required to tell you everything. They don't have to advocate for you. They don't. They're just going to give you the appropriate education. It does not have to be an excellent education. It's just an appropriate education.
We hope it will be. Yes, yes.
But,
yes.
but my
Well,
comment
you know
is,
that the legal term is they have to give you a Chevy. A Chevy,
Oh.
a Chevrolet, okay? Instead of a Porsche.
Okay.
so that explains it. But also, the report card that my son gets, who has autism and has ADHD, makes it look like everything is fine. Because
Yeah.
it's the same report card that all the other kids get, and it doesn't really reflect what's on his IEP. That's how I feel.
Report cards, I would say, especially since the pandemic, I feel like grades have kind of gotten inflated a lot over time. I would take them with a grain of salt. And if you're seeing challenges, I would still talk and ask questions. So let's say the report card is all A's, 4s, whatever, 1s, I don't know what every single school utilizes as their grades. But you still see what you think are challenges, you ask questions and you say, this doesn't make sense from what I'm seeing. If you have an IEP, there should also be goals that are being tracked. Are the goals being met? And if they're not, you can ask, this doesn't make sense. There's a discrepancy. He did so well in math, but the goal is about math and he's not meeting it. Like, how do you explain this? And ask the school what's going on there. But grades are not everything.
Yeah, the report card is, like satisfactory and I did challenge it, and then the answer they gave me is that, the state of Connecticut, every child has this, and I'm not sure if it like mixes in with the average, so that the state
That's
gets.
unfortunate. And then you don't even look at the report. The report card is meaningless at that point, right? And I have to say, I don't look at many anymore. When I look through records, the report card's a very small detail in that now because I really look to the actual data itself. Show me a writing sample versus a report card sometimes. Yeah.
I think if you guys have 504 plans as opposed to IEPs, and your kids are really struggling or have an ADD or autism diagnosis or even dyslexia or something that you think is not being met at all through the 504, that's when to discuss having an IEP and getting more services through that.
Right, because under the federal law, IEP, they're required to provide progress reports related to the items in the IEP. And and that's individualized to your child's needs, right? So they should be addressing every single item in that individualized educational plan and whether or not that child is meeting those goals that are outlined. Yes, you should be getting, before your annual
You should have the data.
PPT.
Yes, yeah.
Before your annual PPT, you should be getting an updated progress report. And in some cases, when you have a PPT about the IEP, everybody understand all this vegetable soup, essentially, letter vegetable soup. But some IEPs actually require that you get more than just an annual update, that you receive it quarterly from the school, a progress report on the IEP goals.
Right, that's exactly what's important, is everybody's IEP is gonna be different. So if you and your team decides that you're gonna get together every month or every 3 months or whatever and sit down with the speech pathologist, if that's the issue, or the special educator, if it, whatever the issue is, it's very particularized. That's why it's an individualized educational program. So but a 504 plan is a very different animal, and it doesn't need goals and objectives. And it is, it is not as, it is not as impactful.
It's not as rigorous, I feel like, in terms of following your child and their progress in the system. So-
And many of the teachers don't even look at it.
Or they don't even know it exists, I
Right.
think. So another plug for SPED NET. You have some amazing resources here to ask some questions about these very specific situations as well.
Hi, yes, I have a son who is on an IEP. He's been on an IEP since kindergarten. He did receive private evaluation, I guess semi-private evaluation. This was in a different school system, but he was only 5 years old. We are now coming up for his triennial at school. I mean, I kind of believe that we should be getting a full private evaluation at this point. I've heard that you don't have to maybe get the whole gamut of a private evaluation. I'm trying to discern, is there ever a situation where you do some testing through the school and some private, or is that too piecemeal?
So I've had individuals come to me after a school evaluation and say, but they miss the social cognition piece. And I say, okay. And so I'll do a abbreviated battery that maybe just looks at that particular area. So that can be also a little helpful financially, right? Because you can go through the school and get your assessment and then say, they didn't answer my question about attention or executive functioning or about social cognition. So maybe I can call a private practitioner to supplement with some of those pieces. So yeah, that can definitely happen. Every provider might be different, but yes, I would say most people would say yes.
Is there any difference in the administration of a standardized test? Like, for instance, a WISC being given by a special education teacher within school versus a neuropsychologist?
It shouldn't be. A standardized assessment should be administered in a standardized way. If you feel that the scores in front of you do not represent your child, and maybe this provider brought in bias or whatever it might be, they're human. We are human. Maybe they had a bad day and took it out on your kid. That should never happen. But if you feel this isn't my kid, then you can ask for a repeat of a different assessment, maybe of IQ from a different provider. So you wouldn't give the same IQ test again within a short period of time. That could invalidate the results. There's exposure and all these pieces. So instead, maybe there could be an alternate one. So if anybody feels that the testing privately too, like if anything doesn't sound like your child, it's not accurate, you can always ask questions and ask for more.
And I'm sorry, last question. How far in advance do you have to book private psychological testing? Because I understand it can be quite a long time to wait. So if you are then waiting for more months after, if you're not satisfied with a certain test and you're trying to figure out what is our IEP next year looking like,
Yeah.
I'm kind of thinking we need to start booking now and just
It really
have a booking.
it's so different from one provider to the next. There are many who can book out almost a year in advance, some that are booking the next month. It's going to really vary from one to the next. The process itself, I think I showed you, it's interview, then about 2 testing dates, and then feedback. That could be completed in 3 weeks, and then you could get a report the next week. So it could be done in about a month. Or you could be waiting 6 months and then that. So it's just going to vary from one professional to the next.
As far as school personnel doing some testing, as well as an independent evaluator, that happens all the time. So, I mean, at least in Wilton, it does. I mean, we would have a neuropsychologist do part of it, especially if it's an independent educational eval, or if the school is the school is paying for it, then we'll say, oh, the speech pathologist can do this little part, or whatever it is.
Sure.
And as far as the difference among providers, I mean, I think the place where you see that a lot is in the recommendations. So you want the recommendations to be really, really focused, and you want this team to be able to implement them. And we see so many evaluations that have very poor recommendations.
And when you describe a poor recommendation, you would say they're too broad? They're not specific? Okay, yeah.
They couldn't make a SMART goal, right?
That's unfortunate.
Okay.
Do you find that having an official diagnosis helps continue services in terms of having an IEP or having a 504? Because my daughter is 6, she has an IEP. We have a few working diagnoses, but nothing's been officially diagnosed. She's been evaluated by the school. She has a private therapist. And just wondering in terms of next steps in 2 years when we have
Yeah.
our reeval, if I should have had an official neuropsych eval to have this diagnosis to help support continuation of services.
Again, unfortunately, the answer is going to be it depends. A diagnosis does not always get you access to a 504 or an IEP. This has been much more, I see it much more, I think, recently than I ever have before. It's really all dependent on if the school sees it impacting the accessibility to the academic situation. So a diagnosis of ADHD does not mean you will get accommodations. It only means that if the school also sees the impact and you share the impact, and then there's some schools I work with that like accept everybody. Yeah, of course, we want to work with you and do this, and others who completely reject. So it really is a case by case basis. But if you're feeling that your child is not receiving what they require, and you think that they will meet criteria for a diagnosis, if they went, maybe the therapist could talk you through that a little bit, then you can decide if that would be an appropriate intervention for you. It just doesn't guarantee that you will get that.
Having a second grader who was previously taught the science of reading program and is now entering into her first year as EL education with suspected dyslexia and have notified the school and the district through the years. The response this year wasn't to go forward with testing, but to give the curriculum time to play out. Does that
Okay.
seem like a reasonable approach for
So
that learning
the
disorder?
mainstream curriculum time to play out, or you mean they're giving specialized intervention?
No specialized intervention, give the mainstream curriculum time to catch the student up from the 2 years of previously under that, like, sold a story, science of reading
Oh, the
program.
I think it's called balanced literacy and then the science of reading. So you're saying that your child was not taught phonics. Now they're teaching phonics and they're seeing, will that support them? That is an intervention that is out there. Yes, that you do teach now the basics of reading and see if that improves. If you are not seeing progress, if you're seeing extremely slow progress, and if it's impacting social or emotional functioning, I would ask for more. But that is a possible path that is taken. Thank you all so much. I love doing these talks, and what an amazing group to be partnering with. And I think they can answer many more questions too. So thank you all for having me today and coming out on this a little gloomy day. Yeah.
Thanks, Yael. That was
Thanks.
really terrific.
Thank you.